So in the previous video, we looked at how all these theories like agenda setting, framing, gatekeeping are related to each other, and that they're all part of the same kind of process. What we haven't really talked about yet is the building blocks of the theories themselves. And I decided to choose agenda setting to go through these building blocks. So this is sort of how to connect theory building like we did in the first part of the course with analyzing how those theories are actually have been built by scholars over time. And I'll start with Davis's article about the crime news in Colorado newspapers. And I'm using this paper for several reasons. It is explaining the outcome of research very well. There's not much of a lit review here. That wasn't a big thing early on in mass communication research, but it definitely gives you some good results on how agenda setting is being measured. Another reason why I want to show this is because this is one of the very first empirical tests of agenda setting, even though the term agenda setting was coined 20 years later. And it became famous through work by McCombs and Shaw that are still publishing about agenda setting these days. The one thing that I always thought was very fascinating, even though McCombs and Shaw have claimed agenda setting to be their own, as far as I know, Max McCombs has never cited this Davis article, even though it was clearly agenda setting research. But in all the book chapters and journal articles, I don't think the Davis paper has ever been acknowledged as an early agenda setting study. So that's one of the reasons why I always like my students to read this article, because otherwise it's just very hard to find looking at references of other work from the 70s and later on. So Davis is concerned about the actual crime news, the coverage of crime. And what you would expect is that there's a certain crime rate, and that rate should reflect the amount of attention in news, so the amount of crime news. So the idea is that if the crime rate goes up, you would expect, going the wrong way, you would expect that the amount of crime news would increase as well. And the other way around. So if there's less crime, you would expect there to be less attention to crime in the news coverage. But his argument, and what he calls hypothesis 1, which is technically a null hypothesis, because he is explaining that there is no relationship between changes in crime rates and the amount of crime news. So his first hypothesis is really focusing on gatekeeping. The gatekeepers make decisions on news coverage on a variety of things, but the change in crime rate may not be one of them. But Davis doesn't stop there, because he is also interested in how the public estimates the crime rates. And that's the second hypothesis. And he says that the public opinion about Colorado crime trends reflects trends in the amount of newspaper coverage rather than the actual Colorado crime rate. So the second hypothesis is actually looking at agenda setting. And then automatically, even though he doesn't describe it that way, there's a third hypothesis in here, that he says that crime rates doesn't predict estimates. I guess I should have said don't, but that there is no relationship between crime rates and estimates. So this is the model we're working with, and this is what he found. So the crime rates went up slightly in this time period and then even declined a little bit at the end. But those percentages didn't really reflect the coverage of the Sentinel and the Telegraph. As you can see, crime news exploded in the Sentinel between the third and fourth period, even though the actual crime rate dropped slightly. And in the same period, also the Telegraph was increasing its crime coverage tremendously, even though it was covering it as a decrease. The coverage was actually decreasing in the first period when the actual crime rates were increasing. And for the other newspapers, the effects were a little bit less dramatic, I guess, than the Sentinel. But still, also for those newspapers, crime news increased in the last period, even though the actual crime rates went down. So there was evidence that there's actually no relationship between crime rates and crime news. And he thought it was actually very shocking that the percentages actually went in the opposite direction at some points. And he also noticed, as you see in the graph here, that the percentage changes in crime news vary tremendously from one newspaper to another. So, like I talked about earlier, there are multiple gatekeepers in the media system. So, as a result, you probably don't have the same coverage over and over again, even though, think about the routinization, they may still have a lot of similarities in what they are presenting each day, but not necessarily on the amount of crime coverage. Now let's focus on the second hypothesis. So the idea here is that the green bars should reflect the amount of the orange bars more than the gray bars. So the estimates of the public will be related to the crime news and not necessarily the crime rates. And when he looked at the total crimes, yeah, there was a slight increase of, the number of estimates, percentage of estimates were slightly higher on total crime than the actual crime rate, but not that much. Now, when he just specified for stealing, there was a big difference. So the crime rate was below 20%. The amount of of stealing articles in the newspapers was much, much higher. And also the estimate of the crime rate is double of the actual crime rate. So this is some good evidence in support of hypothesis 2. And the same with violent crimes. So where the number of violent crimes actually declined, or at least the percentage declined, that wasn't the case for the crime news, and also the public thought that there were more violent crimes. So again, evidence in support of the second hypothesis. Now for rape, there was a different story. The public thought that the estimates were, or thought that the percentage of crime rates for rape went up, while in fact that declined very much, and even more shockingly, that the amount of rape articles declined even more than the percentage of rapes as part of crime. So that's the evidence against not in support of hypothesis 2. So we actually had some mixed findings. He also put in a warning. So I didn't find all the effects in the same direction, but still for violent crimes and for stealing, there is correlation but not necessarily causation. So the question of whether newspaper coverage caused the estimates to be what they were would still have to be answered, since association, so correlation, does not prove causation. And he already anticipated that outcome. So the survey interviewers also asked the survey participants on what exactly they based their opinion when it comes to crime. So what kind of information did you receive that you based the opinion on? And an overwhelming majority called newspapers as an important source, and a quarter of those people gave newspapers as the sole response. So Davis concluded that even though that still doesn't necessarily prove causation, he felt a little bit more comfortable by making the claim that crime news leads to estimates by the public, because the people self-identified the crime news as an important source of information about crime. So that's an important thing for your research too, even though you may not always be able to get the ultimate evidence. In fact, almost never ever will you have the ultimate evidence. But you can bolster your case by adding other elements. In the next video, I will talk about the Barabbas and Jarrett paper, which basically builds on the foundation laid by Davis.